This interview is part of the SSCA Circumnavigators Summit, sharing experiences of members who circumnavigated. All engaged in this project are volunteers providing information solely for entertainment and education purposes. SSCA may edit and publish the interviews in the SSCA Circumnavigation Summit in audio and video formats to benefit its membership and as a recruiting tool. SSCA and participants assume no responsibility for the accuracy or validity of information shared in these interviews. Opinions stated do not necessarily reflect those of the Seven Sea Cruising Association.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the SSCA Circumnavigators Summit. My name is Jackie Lee from Trimaran Sloopmoosh, and I have the privilege to interview some of these special members who have completed a circumnavigation. Many volunteers at SSCA are working hard to make the organization new and fresh and relevant to our members. So we hope you will enjoy this new series. Many sailors wonder what it takes to make a circumnavigation and whether they could do it. We will be interviewing SSCA members who did it. Believe it or not, over 100 members sailed around the world just in between the period between 2001 and 2019. And bravo to them. You will have a chance to hear many varied types of sailors. Solo sailors, families, 2 to 3 year voyages, 20 plus years, international members, former SSCA board members, motor vessel owners, celebrities, and regular sailors just like us. So, without further ado, let's get right to the interview. Okay, welcome everyone. Today's interview is going to be a very interesting one. It's going to be talking with someone who did a navigation quite a while ago and on a much smaller boat than most of us may do now, but it's going to be, I imagine, very interesting to find out how circumnavigating was. Okay, our guest is going to be Robert Rowland, and his boat was called Kiana. And Robert's talking to us today from Elkhart, Indiana, and he's going to let us know all kinds of great stuff about his circumnavigation and perhaps some of the wise things he learned about circumnavigating the world. Okay, welcome, Bob.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
As we talked before, we got a note from you on the forum that says, I don't think people will be interested in what I did because everybody's on a bigger boat now and you just had the basics. And you got quite a response on the forum where people said, no, I think it will be very interesting to hear how your circumnavigation was. And I agree. So you graciously agreed to do this interview, and I think it's going to be a very fun time. So thank you for agreeing to do this.
Glad to do it, and I do hope that people profit by it, or at least makes them think through the process before they begin a circumnavigation, or even while they're on one.
Right. Okay, so can you briefly tell us your background and how you got into sailing?
Well, I didn't get into sailing until I was about 38. And the reason was I'm a marine geologist by training, and I always worked on oceanographic ships starting when I was 20. And I didn't want a hobby that took me any back to sea. It was only when I was transferred to the U.S. Geological Survey headquarters office in Virginia, and friends took me sailing on a sailboat in Chesapeake Bay, that I realized I could combine what I knew, which was knots and navigation and things like that, but I didn't know anything about sails. But I realized that once I learned about sails and sailing, then I could combine what I learned, and I could enjoy sailing because I was chained to a desk, and I could get away on the weekend and go sailing. And I later on did my, after starting work on oceanographic ships, I later on worked on oceanographic ships as far from San Diego to Mauritius, and then also out of Nome, Alaska.
All right, yeah, that's getting sea time on big ships, and as we're going to find out, you actually went around on a pretty small ship. Okay, so when did you get Kiana, and why did you get that particular boat?
I bought Kiana after in 1980 or 81, and I bought it because it was an undercut full keel sailboat, and a person had raced a similar boat like that in a single-handed race from San Francisco to Hawaii, and they also sailed it back. That was not my boat, but my boat was an identical designed boat, and I had been on a boat that had a fin keel with a very flat section forward of the keel, and when you sail to Hawaii, you sail sort of the hypotenuse directly there, but when you sail back, you sail straight north into the wind and waves, and then you make a right-hand turn to about the coast of Oregon, and then you sail south to San Francisco. And I really didn't want a boat that had a fin keel, and I didn't want a boat that had a large flat section forward of the keel that would pound incessantly. I wanted a boat that would sort of fall into or cut the water, and that's why I had the sailboat. That's why I chose the sailboat that I did. I did not buy the sailboat that raced in the Hawaii race, but rather I purchased another one that was for sale in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, and the same model. That's very interesting. Great. And after you got Kiana, what year did you already plan to circumnavigate, or did you plan to just kind of sail around and short sails and not really think about cruising?
No, well, one of the things is that when I bought my first sailboat, which was just on O'Day 23, I was working for the U.S. Geological Survey in Reston, Virginia, and sailing on the Chesapeake. And then I was transferred back to the office in Palo Alto, California, and there is where I bought, when I was there, then I bought Kiana. But always I sailed on other people's boats too, because I wanted to get as much experience I could. And on every boat you go on, whether it's yours or someone else's, especially if it's someone else's, you learn good things and bad things, and that helps you form the decision process as to what you need for a boat.
All right, perfect. I think you did the right thing. Get as much experience on as many different boats, and then you have a good idea of the one that you want. Okay.
Right.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and no boat is perfect, by the way. I mean, all boats are compromises. Whether they're compromises in design or compromises in space or compromises in the amount of money you have, whatever they are, all boats are compromises. So there's no perfect boat. But on the other hand, there are some that more closely match what you plan to do.
Right. And as you told us before, when we were talking before we started this interview, why did you name your boat what you did?
I named it Kiana, which is a town in Alaska that I, by the way, have never visited. But most of my work off the coast of Alaska was out of the town of Nome, Alaska, Nome. And I didn't want to name the boat Nome because I was afraid as I got older I would turn into a gnome, a G-N-O-M-E, and I didn't want that to happen.
That's a cute story. And tell us again the size of Kiana.
Kiana was 9 meters long or 30 feet long. and it was about 4.5 tons in weight.
Okay. All right. So a very compact little boat. Okay. What year did you actually start your navigation, and from where did you consider you started your circumnavigation?
I started from Annapolis, Maryland, and I went south down the Intercoastal Waterway on the U.S. East Coast to Florida, and I left from Florida.
And how many years did it take you to circumnavigate, and what was the general route?
Let's see. I left, I think, when I left the U.S. Geological Survey, when I took early retirement, I think that I went south, and then I got the boat ready, and then I was going to sail around the Caribbean from St. Petersburg, down the coast through the Bay of Islands, and down to Panama that way. And I went and I started out that way, and I turned back. And what I realized was that reason Columbus called it Cape Gracias a Dios off of Honduras is it was by the grace of God, which is what it took him almost a month to try to get around that cape. And my crew at the time became incapacitated. I turned back to the Bay of Islands. The crew flew home. Another person, a friend of mine, Bill Wright, flew down, and he and I sailed the boat back to Key West. In Key West, I put a monitor self-steering vane on the back, and then I left from there to go clockwise around the Caribbean. I sailed from Key West up the coast of Florida, across to the Bahamas, out to San Salvador, and then straight from San Salvador to Panama.
Okay, wow. Yes, another thing when we were talking about your boat, some people that didn't see the forum and what your equipment was, can you tell us how she was equipped?
Well, when I bought the boat, it didn't have anything. I don't even remember if it had an anchor. I really only had a VHF radio. I didn't have a single sideband, and I initially was just using electric autopilots, but I realized that the autopilots took a lot of electricity, and because the boat had a tiller steering, the autopilot unit was mounted on deck, and in wind and waves and things, it took a lot of water, and so the autopilots often drowned. Let me say initially, too, that I didn't intend to sail around the world. I intended to sail as far as Australia. I figured if I made it to Australia, I could give the boat to the Sea Scouts, I could sell it, or I could ship it home. Part of the reason that I didn't intend to sail around the world was I had been as far as Mauritius on oceanographic ships, and Africa was in front of us. And I knew that one way it was really grim weather going south around Africa. I knew it was tough that way. And the other way, going up through by Yemen, up the Red Sea, I knew that way was often difficult too, as at that time there was fighting going on in Somalia, and often I didn't feel that the people might be all that friendly to Americans. So I was leery of going north or south, and I initially started out to only sail to Australia. By the way, by the time I got to Fiji, I realized I had worked out most of the kinks on the boat, and that I was a much better sailor too. So it was really when I got to Fiji that I decided that I might try to go all the way around. And I did go all the way around, and I did do it by going north from the Seychelles. I went north to Djibouti, and then up the Red Sea, and then through the Mediterranean, and back to Florida.
Okay. Wow, that's great. That's great that you weren't really intending to do it, but then after you got to a certain point, you said, well, why not? I can do it. Just wanted to ask you again, tell us what kind of comforts you had on board. Did you have a refrigerator? Did you have any of those luxury things?
No, I didn't. I had no refrigeration. I just kept food in the refrigerator. It was just an insulated box. I just kept food in that, and I only had a single burner stove, which was a C-swing stove, so that it was doubly gimbaled. And if it was rough weather, I mean, you could put a pot on it, and it had fingers on it that would hold the pot in place. So I had a single burner stove, and as I said, I only had a VHF radio, and when I started out, I had a navigation system that used transit satellites. And transit satellites were okay as you get near the equator with transit satellites, because they were all in polar orbit. They were relatively widespread, and you might only get a fix or two a day. But you got to remember, when you're only making about 120 miles every 24 hours, you know, there isn't much to run into out there anyways. You do need to keep watch on deck, and I did that with the crew because there were always two of us. Someone was always on deck, because you got to watch out for big boats. A big boat will run over a boat like mine and never feel it or never realize it until the next time they happen to haul the boat out of the water, the big boat out of the water, and find out that there's a little bit of rigging stuck in the propeller.
Yes, we've heard horror stories about that, so yeah, for sure it's an essential thing to keep a watch out. Okay, so that was good. And then what were the years that you circumnavigated?
When I started out the second time to go around the Caribbean in a clockwise direction, that was I started out in January of 1990, and I sailed back into Key West in June of 94 to the exact same dock that I left in 1990.
Okay, great. That's a wonderful journey. Okay. How did you hear about SSCA, and why did you decide to join up?
I can't remember exactly when I joined. I joined, and then some years later I realized I could put in for ocean certificates. And then later on, I realized I could put in for a Circumnavigators certificate. So I put all those things in. I met quite a few people, actually, that were SSCA members as I was sailing around the world. And interestingly enough, a lot of the people were Australians, and some were Swiss. And and it was those people who the behavior of those people encouraged me to join SSCA.
Okay, so it was the quality of the people of the SSCA. Yes, well,
that's correct.
Okay, well, both of us, you and I, and Luke, are of that quality. So we're very glad that you became an SSCA member and are still today. Now, let's go to a subject about weather. How did you get weather information back then, and what did you do to avoid any bad weather, and do you have a bad weather story?
Well, I don't really have a bad weather story. What I did was, somewhere in the course of the cruising, I had acquired Jimmy Cornell's book on ocean sailing routes. So I could tell from his book what time to sail. In other words, it's very important when you're sailing across the Indian Ocean to the Seychelles from Bali, Indonesia, and then when you're sailing from the Seychelles up around the Horn of Africa to Djibouti and those places, it's good in those places to know what time of year is the best time to make those trips. So I used Jimmy Cornell's book to do the planning. I really didn't worry much about day-to-day weather because there's not much you can do about that. I did worry about seasons and the various seasons. I stayed in when there was a cyclone season, of course, I stayed in Fiji, and then I stayed another cyclone season the year before that in part of Tahiti, And so, and then I sailed in another cyclone season. I had the boat on land in Australia.
Okay, yeah. So when you were in Polynesia, the chances of cyclones there are pretty remote. And then Fiji, I suppose you stayed around an area that had good hurricane holes. And then Australia, that was wise to put her up on land. Did you, when you were in Australia, did you go back home for the hurricane season, or did you stay in Australia?
Both. I came home and in fact visited both my parents. Of course, as you sail, you get older, but your parents get really old. So I visited them, and I visited my wife, who continued to work at her university job. So I sailed. I returned home, but also when I went back to Australia, there was still a couple of more months of the hurricane season left, or the typhoon season, as they call it. And so I bought a used Toyota in Darwin, Australia, and drove around the country and visited friends, and then drove back up the center of Australia and by Ayers Rock, and then when I returned back to Darwin, I sold a used Toyota. So I did both. I visited the U.S., returned to the U.S., and then I also drove around Australia.
Okay. So, yeah, we didn't go to Australia, or haven't gone there yet. We probably will not sail there because we have dogs, and that's kind of like the worst place to go if you have an animal on board. They'll give you the 80,000 questions, and you have to pay a lot of money. So, but we thought about doing some land travel. Was there any place in particular that you traveled around by car that you were particularly impressed with?
Oh, certainly, yeah. The big national park, Kakadu, which is in northern Australia, there's wonderful preserved Aboriginal paintings in that area, and that's just it was lovely weather when I was there, and then also too, it was wonderful to see the Aboriginal drawings, and even when I drove around Australia, we had thrown a bottle away off of Tahiti, or as we were approaching Tahiti. And that bottle drifted up on a sand spit in Australia, and some people there found it. And the address in the bottle was my parents' address in San Diego. And that, let's see, they wrote a letter that my parents then forwarded or gave to me when I was visiting them in California. And when I went to Australia, I stopped by and knocked on the door and visited those people and told them that I was Bob Rowland, and that I was glad they found my letter.
Okay, I love that story. The old message in a bottle. I think most people have, I don't know whether many people still write a letter and put it in a bottle and throw it. I love that story. That's really wonderful. I'm glad I asked you about that. That's great. Okay, one other thing that we didn't cover yet was, okay, when you got crew members, how did you get crew members to go with you?
Well, I lined up 3 or 4 people before I left the United States, and I had those people. But then also, when it was the hurricane seasons in various places, and I flew home to visit my friends, or to visit my family and my wife and my parents. When I flew home, then I would also call or talk to my friends if they wanted to sail with me. And a lot of my friends realized that they would probably never get another chance to do anything like this. So they would then decide to come and sail with me. Another thing that I found out is that it really can't be your friends who don't have much money. And the reason is, for example, if you purchase a one-way ticket from the U.S. to Fiji, and then by the time we get to Australia, you've got to buy a one-way ticket out from Australia back to the United States, and you can't buy it ahead of time because you don't know when we're going to get to Australia. So, it really has to be your friends who have not only time, but who also have money to afford the airfares.
Okay, that's a good point. A good point. I don't know if during the time you were doing your traveling, but also now a lot of things to think about is people, the airlines don't accept one-way tickets into a country without seeing a ticket out or some ticket to another country. Sometimes they don't accept the fact that your friend says, "Oh, but I'm going out on a boat." Did you ever run into that situation?
Yes, I did run into that situation. When I was in the U.S. and I wanted to fly back to Tahiti, where my boat was, they made me buy a round-trip ticket, which I did buy a round-trip ticket, and then I turned the other half into the company. Excuse me, and received credit for it. I did find that. Also, I'll say that in 1992 or 93, when I sailed around Somalia, hijacking was not really well organized at that time, and so I sailed around it. Also, you got to remember, too, that a 30-foot boat doesn't really have a very big radar signature, and you can hardly see it. So even if people were looking for me, they would have a very hard time seeing a 30-foot boat at sea. And then also, I sailed well off the coast when I went around Somalia. Let's
go there then. One of the questions we have is about piracy or thievery, and how did you plan for security, or how did you deal with security, or did you have any issues?
No, I didn't really have any issues with security. Before I left the United States, a person gave me a pistol because they said, "You're going to the Caribbean," and there was, at that time in the 90s, a lot of drug smuggling in the Caribbean. So they gave me a pistol. And then when I was in Fiji, another friend was shipping their boat back to the United States. And so what they did was they said, "Well, when you check out of Fiji, here's another receipt, get it, and you'll get another pistol." So I actually had 2 pistols with me, but I never needed them or used them. By the way, when I sailed into Israel, I was asked by the guards at the marina in Tel Aviv if I had any guns on board. And because I wanted to leave Israel and fly to the United States and visit my parents, who one of them was ill at that time, I was asked, again, as I said, if I had any guns on board. And I said, yes, I did. And because I felt they was an honest country and they would take them and give them back. But the man at the border, at the marina, just said to me very simply, he said, "Don't worry about the guns." He said, "We have more."
Okay, that's an interesting story. All right, well, good that you didn't have any problems on your travels going up to the Red Sea or through the Red Sea. So
no, when I sailed up the Red Sea from Djibouti, going up the Red Sea, I did sail along the east coast. I sailed along the Saudi Arabian side because my feeling was at that time that if I got stopped or anything like that, or captured, or whatever the term might be, that it would be by government officials, that it wouldn't be by bandits or pirates, as it might be if I sailed along the Somalia side. So I sailed up the east side and of the Red Sea, and by the way, I was not stopped at all between Djibouti and Jeddah, nor was I stopped at all between Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and the southern end of the Suez Canal.
Okay. And how did your little boat do in going up the Red Sea?
Well, I had been through the Panama Canal with my sailboat before, and then I went through when I went through the Suez Canal. The only thing that I found that was difficult to do with there was the pilots, in that if you give a gift to the pilot in the course of your trip, it's as though you've given them nothing. You're still expected to give them more at the end. And I really felt that was overbearing, I guess, to use a polite term. And I learned then not to give anything to people until the end of any given service.
Right, okay. That's some good advice to know also. All right, as far as communications, you said you only had a VHF radio for the whole trip?
That's all I had, yeah. It was, and at that time it was really just about all right. I mean, you would call people on the VHF before you entered their countries or before you entered their ports, and there was no place that required, the only place that required a visa beforehand was Australia, and I acquired that visa in Fiji. And but all the other countries that I visited, you just sort of called the harbor before you approached, and then you sailed into the harbor, and then you cleared in. By the way, the place, interestingly enough, that had the most paperwork was to me, it was Fiji. There was only two of us on the boat, another American guy and I, and at the end of the day, not counting the stamps on our passport, we had 17 pieces of paper.
Yeah, okay. Some of those ex-British countries, I think they kept the British tradition of all the paperwork. And even I think to this day, many of those countries, they have you log in online on their newest, latest, greatest technology as far as keeping track of boats and that. And they also do the old documents and ask you if you have a boat stamp, and then get out the carbon paper and all that stuff too.
Right, that was something that I found. Some places, for example, when I sailed from Townsville in Australia up and around Northeast Cape and then to Darwin, I had to check in at Thursday Island, which was up at the turning point on the north coast, and then go in. But I never left Australian territorial waters, so I was all right.
Did you, at that time that you were going, did the Australians overfly with their airplanes and do any interrogating of you with loudspeakers and that sort of thing?
They overflew us at that time, and they must have noted our position at various times, because I can't remember if it was every day or every few days, but they would always fly over, because they continually patrolled that section of coast from Townsville or Cairns north, and then I think they also patrolled the section that went from Thursday Island westward over towards Darwin.
Right, okay, yeah. They keep a big eye out, the Australians do, for anyone trying to approach their country. Let's see. Oh yes, the question that I was going to ask is that when you took off offshore on a long passage, did you ever feel insecure or vulnerable that you didn't have any communications other than short distance VHF radio?
No, I really didn't. Surprisingly enough, that was really all that was common at the time. At that time in the 1990s, there was a lot of problem with loading and antennas, loading the right cells or whatever they were called for single sideband radios and things like that. I really didn't feel that. Whereas now, of course, the single sideband radios are much smaller, probably more waterproof, and I think the antennas are much easier to use now. Also, licensing is easier to use now too. It's easier to get now too.
That's true. Yes, and if you were doing ham radio exams or that sort of thing, they did away with Morse code and all those crazy kind of things too. All right. So for those of us who do traveling now, it must be an interesting thing to think about how you were much closer to, I would say, the elements and just out there with the ocean itself, and that might be sort of a concept that some people would find kind of foreign. Did you enjoy doing passages out there and just taking whatever the sea gave you?
Yes, I did. And yeah, and the people that sailed with me, by the way, the crew, all except one, were people that I had sailed with before, because a 30-foot boat is relatively confining, but because I had sailed with those people before, either on their boat or on my boat, we knew that we got along. So things were all right. And by the way, some of my friends only did one leg, but some friends came back more than once. There were 15 separate legs to get around the world, and because we got along well, and I didn't really feel stressed about much. That's about the story. There wasn't any stretches that were particularly bad weather. It wasn't really until we got up to going from someplace like across the Mediterranean or something like that, when we got out of the tropics, then there was more squalls and things like that, but or periods of bad weather that was up in the Mediterranean, but it wasn't bad.
Right. How did you sustain yourself financially for your trip, circumnavigation?
Well, financially, I had retired early from the U.S. Geological Survey, so the pension was reduced. But, I figured if you're going to do something like sail around the world, you better go when you're as young as possible, that you think you can do it, because when you get older, your eyes don't get better, your back doesn't get better, you don't get any stronger. So that I went when I was, I started when I was about 50, 51, and that's how it worked out. You don't spend much money. Interestingly enough, because most of our meals at sea were cooked on a one-burner stove, they were one-pot meals. But then, on the other hand, when we were in villages and towns or in port stops, we largely ate out, because especially when I had the guests that were and people to sail with me who were around. So we would eat out most of the time when we were in port.
Right. In Southeast Asia, that would have been very economical. In French Polynesia, you would have had to been pretty judicious about going to restaurants. So I suppose you
right, no, that's correct. Yeah, we got used to eating very small salads in French Polynesia. But in a place like Fiji and stuff like that, the Indian restaurants and things like that are wonderful.
Yeah, okay, great. All right. As you were making your way around the world, did you see other cruisers doing different things just to make themselves sustain themselves financially?
Yeah, you would often see people that were in various ports and places who, after you sailed in, you would talk to folks, and you would learn that somebody around you might know more about electronics, or somebody might know more about diesel engines than you did. There were also some places where people were doing sail repair, things like that. So I often saw people that were, let's just say, that didn't have a consistent financial backing, that they were, in a sense, working, or at least partially working their way around the world, or even not even if it was around the world, just from port to port.
Right. Okay. So there's ways to do that too. If you have, we find that if you have any kind of mechanical skills, you can find work just about anywhere. If you're a good cook, you can also, if you're pretty good a chef or a person that can put together meals for lots of people easily, you can get jobs on charter boats and that sort of thing. So, okay, good. Those are some good ideas about making money. With hindsight, is there anything that you would do differently on your circumnavigation?
Well, not that. One, I'm very glad to have accomplished it, and secondly, to me it was sort of like high school. You were glad to do it once, but you really didn't want to do it again. And yeah, so no, I don't know what I would do. Well, one of the things that influenced me a great deal was that someone once said, for everything you put on a boat will take at least 2 other things to support it. And I think that's true, and especially if you have a lot of electronics, lo and behold, it takes a generator set, and that takes yet another whole engine with hundreds of moving parts just to support the electronics for a navigation system. Whereas sailing across the Indian Ocean, when I did have a GPS on board, we only turned the GPS on about at noon and at midnight just to get our positions, because that was really all we needed. We knew there was nothing to run into out in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
All right, yes. Keep it simple, I think, that was a very good strategy for you. That's good. And what were some of the big highlights of your voyage?
Well, what I really enjoyed was I enjoyed meeting the people that I had worked with, because I had worked in the South Pacific, and I had met people in, as I said, in Tonga, in Vanuatu, in Australia. I had not been to the Seychelles before, but when I was in Israel, I also met people there that friends had met, so that I really enjoyed meeting the people. And secondly, I found out that when you sail to a country and you've sailed your own boat there, the people are more than willing to help you. For example, my uncle owns a welding shop. Do you need anything welded? Can I give you a ride to the grocery store? Do you want to borrow a car? All these things. It didn't matter what country I was in. I found the people were extremely helpful and extremely friendly.
Right, okay. I think that is a highlight of cruising. And it's amazing how generous and wonderful people are, and how you see that all around the world, no matter what your nationality, in general, people are so kind, so generous, and so willing to help and share. So that's a great reflection, Bob. Thank you for that. All right.
And what I would
Go ahead.
add to it is, as a person who had traveled before, when you visit countries, sometimes you think people just see you with a dollar sign or a money sign on your forehead, and they think of how much money they can squeeze out of you. Whereas I found that when you sailed into a country, I found that people were really hospitable.
Okay, that's a great reflection. Yes, it seems like when you sail, you have more time to spend to get to know the local people and how they are, and you find a nicer interaction with them, rather than them seeing you as like you say, somebody with dollar sign, like maybe you're just a tourist that they can rip off or something, but you become more of a friend when you have more of an interaction with them. And then you find that the more that they give to you, you really want to give them stuff and be as nice to them. And so it becomes a wonderful relationship between you and other people.
I agree wholeheartedly.
All right, so after you finished your circumnavigation, did you continue cruising, or what did you do next?
Well, I started writing a book about my trip, and I wrote from, I guess you could say, birth to Fiji. And then I got bored writing, and secondly, I realized nobody wants to read a book about a guy who sailed around the world with his friends one at a time, and nothing went wrong. And so I quit writing the book, and I started looking for work, and I acquired 2 jobs. One was working back for on contract for the U.S. Geological Survey, working on problems created and problems that arise from the Law of the Sea Convention, which I had worked on before when I was a regular employee. And then the second job that I acquired, and this is one that I still have, I started working for a Norwegian company. Earlier in my travels, I had worked at the South Pole when I was in the Army and had worked in the Antarctic. So I started working, lecturing on cruise ships on geology and oceanography, and I included circumnavigation in that. I started working for the Norwegian company Hurtigruten on their ship, the Fram. And I'm still doing that, though, as you can imagine right now, because of the coronavirus situation, a lot of the trips that I worked on this approaching summer in the Arctic are being canceled. But I hope by next Antarctic season that the trips will be in gear again.
Okay, that sounds quite an interesting. That's quite an interesting occupation, and so, in a way, you get to sail, to continue sailing, but you on a nicer, more luxurious kind of deal, and people are still interested in your experiences, and it's quite a fascinating thing, I'm sure, for them to listen to you about your area of expertise, but also about your trip around the world. We certainly have enjoyed hearing about it. Is there any other thing that you want to expand on as we're getting towards the end of this interview?
No, let me say that too, because we only carry about 200 passengers, 180 to 200 passengers on the ship. When people think you work on a cruise ship, they think thousands of people. But if the trips are 14 to 19 days and you only have 200 people, you really get to interact with the people quite well. And they'll ask you, if you give a talk on circumnavigation, maybe they won't ask you a question at the end, but 2 or 3 days later, they might ask you, what did you have for lunch every day? You know, that because we were, one, it's not like a big cruise ship, and then secondly, there was much more interaction with the individual passengers. And I have to admit that because we sometimes get 17 to 20 different nationalities among the passengers, I still really enjoy meeting people from all over the world.
Okay, yes, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And a small world, too, because Luke and I worked a year or so on smaller cruise ships, the sailing cruise ships, the Windstar in Tahiti and in the Caribbean. And as you say, you do get to know the people that are staying, and you get to be good friends, and I suppose there are some that you may even still keep in touch with.
Yes, that's correct. By the way, let me just tell you before we close this out. In Tahiti, there was one of the big sailing ships, and I've forgotten if it was Windsong or Windstar, and we followed them into port, and we were just told to tie up, and they would, we were told by the port authorities to just tie up in the port, and they would go through Customs and Immigration on Monday. Well, our boat was so small that the bumpers were so big that we had a hard time tying up in Fiji and waiting for the customs officials to come on Monday. But overall, and by the way, one of the people on Windstar wanted a tour of my boat, and of course we got a tour of their boat, and it took a lot longer for their tour of their boat, whereas to tour a 30-foot boat doesn't take long at all.
Right, and you can't get too many people on there at once either.
Right.
sort of glance down the companionway and you go, oh, okay, that's nice.
That's it, yeah.
We're glad we're on the cruise ship.
Right. Yeah.
All right. What will your life be like after circumnavigating? Is that something that you want to speak to people about?
Well, yeah. Well, I do. I don't know. I'm older now, but I still don't consider myself retired, because that sort of seems as though you're just sitting in a chair watching the soap operas on TV in the middle of the day, and I don't really want to do that. I like putting together new lectures and things like that for the ships that I work on and for talks that I give, or even revising the old lectures. I've worked on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the geology involved in that for making territorial claims. I really still enjoy all those topics and keeping interested. It's you don't want to just sit in the chair and let the world go by.
Okay, that's very good pearls of wisdom, that your life doesn't end after your circumnavigation. You don't just say, okay, been there, done that, now what do I do? And I hear it in your voice, and I hear it in all the things that you've told us, that you are a person that keeps life exciting, like keeping it fun, keeping learning and sharing, especially the things that you learn. And I'm so glad that you decided to take us up on our invitation to speak on one of these interviews, because contrary to what you said, that you didn't think anyone on a sailboat nowadays, because they're bigger and full of all kinds of technology, that we wouldn't be interested in what you had to say. And I find it has been actually au contraire, the opposite. It's been fascinating and wonderful talking to you, Robert, and I'm so glad that you decided to speak with us. So thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you, and I'll send you a few photographs that you may be able to use later on. But thanks very much for asking me. I too was very surprised that people were interested, and people continue to respond. I look at the SSCA website most every day, so that if people ask me questions, I'll be glad to answer them, as long as it includes their personal email.
If you enjoy this interview, make sure to listen to our other guests in the series, subscribe to SSCA YouTube channel, access the MP3 audio recording on SSCA website, get the scoop on the latest SSCA activities and benefits, read the latest cruiser bulletin, participate in the forum and Facebook group, and please promote our organization to who you think might benefit.